Chag Sameach, everybody. It's been a little while since I gave a sermon, but I feel that this Passover really does deserve some arranged thoughts, so here are mine. In the Pesach Haggadah, Rabbi Gamliel teaches B'chol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person must regard themselves as if they personally had left Egypt. And we normally skip over that passage in the Haggadah because it comes just before dinner, but this year we might want to linger over it for a moment. Rabbi Gamliel is teaching that it's our sacred obligation to locate ourselves personally in the story of the Exodus. We like to joke that just as for every other Jewish festival that we fulfill this task by reminding ourselves that they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. But our circumstances this particular year mean that we're fulfilling the obligation of retrojecting ourselves into the Passover story in a different way. The Torah describes two rites of Passover. The first one is the one that the rabbis call Pesach Mitzrayim. And Pesach Mitzrayim is the original Pesach. It involved taking the lamb, it involved the 10th plague and the moment of the Exodus itself. The Pesach that we actually keep is the other one mentioned in the Torah. It's called Pesach Dorot, and it's marked by the clearing away of chametz and the eating of matzah. But of course this year we can't keep Pesach Dorot the way we like to. The familiar routines leading up to Pesach have been stripped away. Our Seder tables will be small or perhaps even tiny. The closeness that we cherish at this time of year, which for many families is the one full reunion, is being fragmented into icons on a screen across many, many miles. We can't even lift up our voices properly together in song. Israel itself is on lockdown this Pesach to prevent the spread of the virus. But that first Pesach, Pesach Mitzrayim, that's coming into much sharper focus this year. The word Mitzrayim comes from the Hebrew that means tsar, narrow, constricted, and that feeling of being narrow and limited and shut in or maybe even shut down, that's what's going to define Pesach for us this year. I want to stop and say something obvious here. The parallel is not an exact one. Tempting though the analogy is, I think it's problematic to think of coronavirus as a plague like the other plagues in Egypt. We need to be very careful these days with tropes like tyrant and punishment and vengeance. And as I explained to the minister who showed up at Shir Chadash last week, to exhort us to repent and pray for deliverance from God's anger, because that's what it says in our Torah. We live by the Torah as it's interpreted, not as taken literally. And I think it's unlikely for that reason that we're going to be daubing our doorposts with anything this year either. But as we read over the narrative of the rest of Pesach Mitzrayim, it's Exodus chapters 12 and 13, other parallels to our situation do leap to the eye. Right at the beginning of the narrative, the children of Israel are commanded to begin to count time. And then 10 days elapse, 10 days that the Torah telescopes together, telling us absolutely nothing about them, as if nothing distinguishes one day from the next. And on the 10th day comes another commandment, the commandment to take a kid or a lamb, say la mishpacha, a kid or a lamb for each individual family unit. The lamb is to be kept as a mishmeret for a further 4 days before being sacrificed at night. It's to be eaten in a rush while the people are dressed for travel. The only hint that the people are given that the Exodus itself might really be coming. What did the children of Israel do in those 4 days? We don't know. The Torah doesn't tell us. 4 days, quarantine. We do know that they must have been waiting. And that key word, that word mishmeret, turns up later in the story as well, when the night of the Exodus is described as a leil shimurim, a night of vigil, a night of watching, a night, of course, of waiting. I think it's Rashi who teaches that on that night, the Holy One was waiting too, counting down the time, longing for the slavery to end and for freedom to begin. And that feeling, I think, is very true of the time that we are now living through as well. Many teachers describe the Exodus as being the birth moment of the Jewish people, and as every mother knows, birth is a process that involves, most of all, a huge amount of waiting. The contemporary spirituality teacher Carolyn Myss describes waiting as itself a spiritual process. She writes, and I quote, "We have to reconstruct ourselves from the inside out, a process that always brings about numerous changes in our lives. I have yet to find a person pursuing a path of conscious awakening who has not experienced a time of waiting during which his or her interior is reconstructed. And as with all matters of the spirit, once we start along the path, there is no turning back." Well, we're waiting. What will be born out of this year? What will our waiting and our watching make possible? I think it's clear that we won't and can't go back to normal. Anyone who has given birth knows that it changes your life irrevocably. Rebecca Solnit pointed out that emergency is related to emerge, which only underlines that when we come back out, it's not going to be to the same place or state that we were when we went in. 4 is the traditional number for this time of year, so let me offer 4 ideas, 4 possibilities, 4 things that perhaps are waiting to emerge out of this Pesach Mitzrayim, this narrow Pesach. The first is the idea of personal awakening. As we are forced to turn inwards in isolation, we may discover aspects of ourselves. Maybe we have an interest that we never had the time to pursue, a conflict that we never had the will to resolve, or memories we never had the time really to enjoy. Now is the time for us to take them out and examine them and explore them and develop them. The second is the idea of new connections. I heard the other day of a household having a conversation, a really important conversation that they'd never had before. And outside of the boundaries of our homes as well, we're discovering new ways to be in contact, a new kind of glue that is holding communities together. Our intolerance of the idiosyncrasies of others has melted away as we reach out to each other by technology and by phone, and by leaving notes on each other's doorsteps, and by waving to each other as we pass at a distance on the levee. Because this Mitzrayim is teaching us the importance of community all over again. The third possibility is the idea of goodness. There has been an outflow of chesed, of the purest love and tenderness and generosity, which should awaken our deepest feelings of gratitude. Perhaps our Dayenu this year looks like if we only had our garbage collectors, it would have been enough. If we only had the people who are still working at grocery stores and food banks, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If we only had our exceptional, brave medical personnel putting hour after hour in at our hospitals and our centers, Dayenu, it would have been enough. We should add our own verses at our own Sidarim as we acknowledge the new goodness that is pouring through the cracks in this broken world. And we can ask ourselves, we must ask ourselves, how can we be part of that goodness? So, personal awakening, new connections, the outflow of goodness. The fourth idea is the idea of the story itself. It's a mitzvah to tell the story of Passover. We're going to tell it differently this year. I suggest that after the Sedarim are over, we each record somehow an account of our Pesach this year. Could be a drawing, could be a piece of writing, could be on the computer, could be a PowerPoint presentation, or a collection of objects that we set aside, a video recording, a choreography, whatever form works best for us. And I suggest that we keep that record for Pesach next year, so that when we open our Haggadot once more, that memory, that story, now a chapter in our own story of Pesach, rises up to greet us. May that story become part of the story of our own journey from the stringency and pain of Mitzrayim, across the sea, to the mountain of revelation, and on to the promised land beyond. L'shana haba'ah shuv b'yachad. Next year, may we be together again. Have a safe and a sweet and a kosher Pesach. Chag Sameach.